I'll introduce a quick introduction, and then we're ready. You guys ready?
Yep.
Okay. Well, we're back for Chapter 4 with Rudolf J. Siebert, and I really at this point probably don't need to give all too much of an introduction to him, but I will introduce Dustin Byrd, who is my brother, and he is the one who will be kind of carrying the conversation with Rudy and asking the questions because he is the one who's been probably the closest to Rudy in the last 20 years or so, right?
Yeah, over 20 years.
You know, over 20 years. So without any further ado, Dustin Byrd, how are you, Dustin? Thank you for the show, and good morning, Rudy. It's so good to see you.
Good morning.
Good morning. I'm doing well.
Well, there you go. The show is yours.
All right, Rudy. Last time we were together to talk about this, we ended with your coming to America in 1965, take up a teaching position on the East Coast. And then you came here to Western, actually, in 1965. And so we want to talk about that time period. That was a very tumultuous time period in the world, especially in the West. It was the time period of the student youth movement, time period where people were protesting against war, protesting against capitalist exploitation. In Germany, there was a revolt against the government there. And critical theory had a part in that. What kind of part did it play?
Okay, I had been here in the States before as a prisoner of war in Fort Camp Allen in Norfolk, and then I had been here again in 1953 in a leadership course in order to strengthen the whole teaching about the critical theory here. And then we came 1965, we came here for good. And the reason was that the Frankfurt School had predicted Trumpism already early on. So I had been sent to Germany from the prisoner of war camp in order to transform the fascist state into a liberal state, and then I became active to transform it even into a more social state. And then there was the prediction, or there was the suspicion or the fear that what had happened in Europe could happen in the United States. That means that fascism could appear in the United States. And so then we came over here, we settled in Baltimore, and I taught with the Jesuits for 3 years. And then through the Jesuits, they brought me over here to Western Michigan University through Father Harden. And so in 1965, I started here. And that is when, of course, the 60s were already going on, the tumultuous 60s. So a student rebellion, a student movement. The student movement had been motivated by the Frankfurt School, by the critical theory of society, and it spread from Germany to Japan, to the United States, to Italy, so all throughout the West. And the students were motivated by Marx to some extent, then by Bakunin. Many of them were anarchists, and they had no leaders, which was very hard for the FBI and the CIA, because they always looked for leaders, and there were a lot of groups everywhere who had no leaders, which was methodologically, technically for the police a very hard task to deal with. So, and that came to the campus too, Western Michigan University. The students took over the cafeteria, they took the flag down and turned buses upside down. So it was very tumultuous, and in the classroom many teachers were afraid of the whole thing, and it was very unsettling. So during this time I was then the connection between that youth movement, which was centered particularly in Detroit, and the university administration, our university and others as well. And I tried to make understood what the students were all about and why they were rebellious. The students were not working class students, they were middle class students, which was amazing, and they had little contact with the working class. Only in Paris the students marched together with the workers. Otherwise the student movement was not connected really with the working class, which remained rather passive in this whole process. So at that time, then, I had to write a lot of letters to the draft boards in order to get students who didn't want to go to Vietnam to get them referred to the university. And there was one case, a student who had been in our religion department, and he sold encyclopedias and made a lot of money. And he used that money in order to take children out from the north side, from the slums, to take them to the lake for a week or two, because they had no swimming pools on the north side, only water hydrants. And so he did a very good job. And then when he was finished with us, he wanted to go to Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and he wanted to study law, like his whole family. It was a middle-class family here in Kalamazoo, and everybody, all the children, had to study law. So after a year, he came back, and he said that he had become a communist, which was very strange, that somebody goes to a Catholic Jesuit university and then becomes a communist. Nevertheless, he was here, and so I had to write a letter for him about Vietnam, and I wrote, first of all, I said he is a Christian, and there are many Christians in Vietnam. He doesn't want to shoot at Christians, so he should not go. Number two, I said he has become a communist, and there are a lot of communists in Vietnam, and he doesn't want to shoot at communists neither. I said, then he thinks he can be a Christian and a communist at the same time. He must be nuts. So, therefore, the army cannot have more nuts. Please let him go. And next day, I got a letter from the draft board. He was free. He could stay and could study. But then came the Nixonian counter-revolution, which repressed the whole thing. Students were shot and so on. So he went to California, and there could not adjust to this counter-revolutionary movement. He castrated himself, then walked from California to Kalamazoo, was caught in the middle and put into our state hospital, where he still is today. I took him out sometimes, and he thinks God speaks to him, but nobody listens to him. And I told him, we have the same fate, the same thing happens to me all the time. So, he is aged a lot. He looks like 70 or so, and has a hard time to find his way. So that is one of the tragic consequences of the wild 60s and this upheaval, which then was, of course, successfully repressed. Many students found their way to normal life. Others went into the forests and or went to the became Buddhist monks or Benedictine monks, and tried to deal with the counter-revolutionary process afterwards.
Mm. And what did the critical theory learn from this attempt to transform society, attempt to transform the world, and to make it a more reconciled, more peaceful society, but yet to have that kind of counter-movement against it?
So the critical theory, of course, played a great role, obviously, in this global student movement. So there was an anti-fascist type of a theory. People had fascism behind themselves, and it gave new hopes for alternative number 3, a reconciled society, not alternative future number 1, a fascist society, or alternative future number 2, a militaristic society with ABC wars and so on. So it showed a positive way. But then the students came into conflict with their teachers. And the reason was that the teachers were not revolutionary enough. And the teachers were not revolutionary enough because they were afraid that any kind of a revolutionary movement in the German Federal Republic would somehow give a chance to the Democratic Republic, Socialist Republic in the East, to intervene. And so they thought the time had not come for such a revolutionary movement. So therefore it came to the point where one of the great leaders of the Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno, called the police in order to stop the students from taking over the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt. So there was a real serious conflict. There was Rudi Dutschke, who played a great role, and the Frankfurt School people called him a red fascist. Habermas, the great, who had just had his birthday, was celebrated a few days ago in Europe. So he called him a red fascist, but withdrew later on that this was probably not the right name for him. But the Frankfurt School was, of course, critical not only of liberalism, but they were critical also of that Bolshevism. They thought it was red fascism, that Lenin had started out well, but that then the revolution became distracted through industrialization, and there was still the heroic struggle against the 4 million army under Hitler, who marched into Russia, and they were beating that army in Stalingrad and Kursk and Berlin, which was an unbelievable accomplishment. When we think that Eisenhower commanded 60,000 people in the Normandy, there was the first battle in Moscow, which embraced 10 million men on both sides. So there we can see what an unbelievable difference that was. And we always mention of our accomplishment, of course, rightly so, against fascism, but we must not forget that, of course, the Soviet Union carried the main burden of this struggle and lost 27 million people died in Russia. So nevertheless, the Frankfurt School was not, that was called Western Marxism sometimes, against an Eastern Marxism, and so what really collapsed then in the neoliberal counter-revolution was the Eastern Marxism, which of course the Western Marxism has to learn from that, but it was not directly affected by it.
Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting that there's this kind of hinge point between the student movement in the 1960s and into the 1970s as it was fading out, but also in the 1980s, and that hinge is Ronald Reagan. So the critical theorists, especially Herbert Marcuse, struggled with Ronald Reagan in California, and at the same time, it was Ronald Reagan who brought all of these people who were the youth in the 1960s, these revolutionaries. He was the one that brought them back out of their shell in the 1980s and turned them into good consumers. Yeah. So the critical theory here, on the one hand, was very influential on this generation in their beginning when they were coming to their fruition and seeing the world for what it was and wanting to change it. But then Ronald Reagan, in some ways, triumphed over them in the 1980s and brought them into being good consumers, good homo consumens, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, Marcuse was, of course, one of the critical theorists. He was the only one who, for a short time, was a member of the Communist Party in Berlin. And so he presented the critical theory, one version of the critical theory against Reagan, not only in California, but also in Paris. So it was a worldwide movement. And you could say then Marcuse died and Reagan won with his counter-revolution. That means he moved from Keynesianism to the Friedman School in Chicago. That means Keynesianism means that the state pumps a lot of money into civil society in order to prevent depressions, or at least keep them more shallow. So that fascism had used Keynesianism very successfully. Hitler gave 6 million Germans a job in 1934, and they all thought he was a messiah, and this was part of his great success. So then nevertheless, with Friedman, that means then deregulation, and it means privatization, which then was on the presupposition that the New Deal was not necessary anymore because capitalism was stable now. So, and one could now unleash all the forces of capitalism, and then it would deal also with the issue of poverty and so on and so on. So, and that lasted to 2008 when we had this horrible financial collapse in which millions of people lost their homes and their jobs and so on. And since now, under Reagan, of course, under Trump, Reagan's policy are continued, not enough regulation, a lot of privatization, so we have to expect that there will be another 2008, another crisis, and people are aware of this, that this could happen. So, but yes, then a lot of the students became normal, they became conformist, and became consumers, and our classrooms became very quiet. The students did not discuss anymore, as they had done in the 60s, the vital problems of the country. Only now recently, where we have the Democratic Party, suddenly so-called socialists are coming up, so there is a new revival. And so this going up and down will probably happen into the future. So the people, the students in the 60s and also the 80s, in the background there is of course a great philosopher who whom we try to repress in the Great Depression, and that is the philosopher Hegel. He is not supposed to be taught in our universities. He is somehow a persona non grata. But nobody says really why that is so. One could say because he is very difficult, but that is not the real reason. The real reason is that Hegel was the Heracleitos of the 19th century. That means Heracleitos had taught that everything is in motion and that war, including class war, is the cause of all historical movements. So that means all ruling classes, if they are slaveholders, feudal lords, or capitalists, they try to teach their people that their regime will be eternal, that they will be forever. So the slaves were supposed to think that the slaveholders would never disappear, and for 1,000 years the serfs were told that the feudal lords, the kings, the barons, and all this would all be forever. And then, of course, they disappeared, and so also the bourgeoisie is interested that the working masses think that capitalism will be forever, that there is nothing beyond capitalism, and if, then just look at the Soviet Union or Venezuela, and then you know how bad it is. So there is nothing after the bourgeoisie. But of course, what Hegel teaches, and that is why he is so dangerous, and is not supposed to be taught, is that everything moves, and that also ruling classes do disappear and are replaced, and so on. And the bourgeoisie itself, of course, from 1866 on, the first, under Cromwell, the first bourgeois revolution, and then throughout the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, until our Civil War, which was the last bourgeois revolution, and afterwards we have the socialistic revolution, and the student movement was part of such a socialistic type of a revolution.
Mm-hmm. And this all took place in the context of the Cold War. And soon after you came to Western, you started a conference on the future of religion in Dubrovnik, Croatia. Can you tell us the story of how that began?
Yeah. Well, there was one great man, Ivan Supek, the president of the University of Zagreb. And he had studied under Heisenberg, who developed the bomb for Germany, and was a little bit late. His colleagues in the States were faster, and when the bombs finally, when the bomb was thrown on Japan, Heisenberg could not believe that they had done it, but he forgot that all his Jewish colleagues had left Germany and were now part of the Manhattan Program, and that they had become better than he. So nevertheless, Heisenberg educated this Ivan Supek. He was one of his best students. Ivan Supek was taken by the Gestapo as a British spy, and Heisenberg, because of his great influence, freed him, liberated him. And so then the Gestapo man asked Ivan Supek where he would go, and he said, I want to go home to Zagreb, to Croatia, and my father dies from cancer. And so the Gestapo man said, why do you want to go to those inferior people in Croatia? Why don't you stay here? And so on. So nevertheless, he went home anyway, joined the partisans, never became a communist, never became a Marxist, but he joined the partisans against fascism, and then, nevertheless, not being a socialist at all, became the president of the University of Zagreb, and taught quantum physics, a very beautiful teacher. He asked me once that I should declare to him or explain to him in dialectical terms what the law of gravity was, and So I put a few formulas on the blackboard, and then he told me what that would look like in terms of quantum physics, and he went through the whole classroom and filled all the blackboards there with his formulas, and it was very, very complicated. So, but we remained friends nevertheless. As a matter of fact, we became more and more friendly. But nevertheless, Tito asked him, or rather the Tito government asked him to build a bomb for Yugoslavia, and he refused. Unlike Heisenberg, his teacher, he did refuse, he did not build the bomb. It went even further. He did not teach quantum physics anymore, because quantum physics had led Einstein to write that letter to Roosevelt that this could deliver a beautiful weapon. And so he instead now became the leader of a peace movement. He came to the States, to Canada, and he came to Western. And here he invited us to participate in his new institute in Dubrovnik. And so that is when I then, 1975, I went there and I taught the first course on Marxism and religion and phenomenology and so on in Dubrovnik, 2 courses. And at the end of the course, the professors from the University of Zagreb asked me to develop a course on religion. And I had ended up each of my papers with the future of religion. So I called the course Future of Religion. And that then took up another course which had taken place north of Dubrovnik, where people of the Frankfurt School and so on met every year, but they were somehow repressed by the Tito government. So after this course was repressed, then we took off and continued it in Dubrovnik then for 43 years up to this year. So that is how it came about, and in this course we were concerned, you know, with, as the title says, what would become of religion in terms of this modern antagonism between the religious and the secular, and continually more and more secularization and more culture wars about abortion, about gay marriage, and so on and so on. Every week we have a new culture war. And so in this course, and before already, but in this course we developed this critical theory of religion in order to help to resolve culture war problems. That is the real purpose. Some of these culture wars are bloody, like we have it with ISIS and so on, in the Near East or in Africa, and some of them are not so bloody, but are very, very complicated and very problematic for family life and so on. So that is the real purpose of the critical theory, which was developed in Dubrovnik. And then I founded a sister course in Russia, in the Crimea, in Yalta, and that was called then Religion in Civil Society. The reason for that was that the neoliberal counter-revolution brought in some kind of a follow-up revolution, because when Lenin made his revolution in St. Petersburg, Russia was very backward in terms of development of the bourgeoisie and of civil society. So I thought that to catch up, that Russia would catch up and would develop a civil society before they would do anything else. In this context, I introduced that course then in Yalta, and so that went on for 20 years until we were stopped by the sanctions against Russia, which forbid us to not to go there, but to have any activity. I could not preside over the course, I could not sign the 250 certificates for the Russian professors. So, and that is still going on. I'm still not able to do, I cannot even Skype without, you know, damaging the reputation of the university and paying punishment to the Treasury Department and so on. Personally, I'm at the university, so I could simply not go on. But I hope that the sanctions will be lifted, and because there is now a Republic of Crimea, it is a matter of fact now, there will be no way back, and they have joined the Russian Federation and the 13th Republic, and so our sanctions have not had any effect. The Chinese helped to supplement where the sanctions hurt and so we have to take that now as a matter of fact that there is this republic. So nevertheless, in this context, I thought it was a good thing for the Russian society to lift up civil society, which the Soviets had repressed. So while here the danger is that the civil society takes over the state, in Russia the state had taken over civil society. And then things become very backward in terms of technology and so on. So I hope that we can continue that work in Yalta, and that civil society will develop further in the Slavic world.
Right. Now, but back in Dubrovnik, Croatia, obviously there was a war going on for a long time in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Excuse me. And you continued to go. The conference never ended. It never stopped.
Right.
Yeah. It was never skipped for a year or 2 years while that war went on.
Yeah.
Tell us about that experience, because as an old soldier, you were now back into a conflict zone.
Well, it was very helpful to me that I had been a soldier, that I had been trained in the Second World War to go to Russia as an anti-tank person. So I had some military skills which were helpful in this horrible civil war of 5 years. I was in Belgrade when the war started and was caught up there and couldn't get out. I asked the American ambassador there. He said, "You have to get out, you have to get out." I said, "Well, how should I get out? No plane flew, no train, nothing," and so on. And the Serbs were very happy in a certain sense. They said the Croats somehow they needed another war, and then that they could also take care of the Battle of the Valley of the Blackbirds, which had taken place in 1398 or something like that. So people in Europe remember, even after centuries, it is as if it was today. So they prepared now for that war, and they finally wanted to take care of that battle of the 14th century, in spite of the fact that that time the Turks were involved, so it was not the same people, but nevertheless it was the same battle which they went on fighting. So, but I found a way finally. The train was going, it was going through the battlefield, so there was shooting as we went toward Dubrovnik. And then I had this course of that first year of the Civil War, the course which had all the members of all 6 republics, 6 states of Yugoslavia. They were all there peacefully for 20 years, and the self-management system had worked very well. The worker had managed the universities, the yacht, the airline. Everything worked beautifully without capitalists. They hired their CEOs and fired their CEOs, and the main thing of capitalism is the private appropriation of collective labor. So they changed it from the private appropriation to collective appropriation. That means the workers who produce the surplus value also appropriate it, and not the capitalist who does not work. So that change was made. They paid themselves a salary, but then the surplus value came back to them in terms of free education and free hospitals and so on. So that was one version of socialism, very different from the Soviet thing, and they kept independent from Stalin, which was a great accomplishment. So yes, and I went there every year, sometimes several times a year. It was very dangerous, either by ship. There was no airplane for some time, and I had huge suitcases with medicine from Abjan here, and a lot of money, and I brought that to Dubrovnik, and we distributed the medicine to all the wounded Croats, Serbs, whoever was there. I could not bring myself to suddenly to hate the Serbs or to love the Croats and so on, so we gave it to everybody, distributed the money and the medicine through a very old drugstore from the 9th century. So they gave the medicine then to everybody who was wounded in town, because all the villagers had come into Dubrovnik when the Serbs attacked, the Serbian army attacked, and the Serbian army marched into Croatia, and the Croats could not really resist. They came up to the doors of Dubrovnik, which has huge walls, and it was a very medieval atmosphere, the tanks, and then the Dubrovnik, the city which had never been conquered. So the Serbs said, you know, you are fascists, you know, surrender. They didn't surrender, so they put a bomb on the water supply, no water. Then they said fascists will surrender, they didn't, and so they put another bomb on the electricity tower, so the city was dark and without water. And then the UN came in and rescued it. So the war was stimulated by the CIA and by the Pope and by Germany, particularly by Germany, because they did not want to bring cheap labor into the country, but wanted to put the instruments of production into the other country in order to save the social costs. So they wanted to follow our way of doing it, and the socialists did not agree to that, so a regime change was necessary, and it was one of those over 20 regime changes which we made, and it was a successful one. So,
Well, all right. I think that's probably a good time to take our break.
Okay, well then that is what we'll do. That was the third chapter with Rudolf J. Siebert as an autobiography of his life, which is certainly quite remarkable. Stay tuned and be on the lookout for Chapter 4. We are back, and we're back with Rudy J. Siebert, and we are going to do the fourth chapter of his life. This is the biography. I think my brother Dustin John Byrd, where are we right now, Dustin? 19 what?
Well, we're moving now into the 1980s.
Okay, so we're now moving into the 1980s, and just as usual, my brother is here who's going to be taking over the questions and talking to Rudy, who really needs no introduction if you haven't been listening so far. But like I said, here we are at the beginning of Chapter 4. If you haven't heard Chapter 1, 2, and 3, you might want to listen to those before you get caught up. But I do say regardless, that probably will stand by itself. So, Dustin, it's all yours.
All right, Rudy. Now, in the 1980s, you began the Center for Humanistic Future Studies. Can you tell us more about that? What does that include? Future studies.
Yeah, that is of course a very strange thing, because people think we don't know anything about the future. So how can one say anything about it, particularly scientific? So, nevertheless, I started the Center for Humanistic Future Studies with my colleagues on campus, maybe 15 or so, from anthropology and different disciplines. And we started a minor, not only courses, but a minor, and we were very successful. A lot of students were interested and took that course. But then, after a few years, suddenly the dean of the liberal arts, she cancelled the course. She said I had too many foreigners in the course, but everybody knew that this was not the real reason. And so people thought, what are the reasons? And so there had been a scholar, Ossip Flechtheim, who in 1943 came to the States as a Jewish refugee, and he had tried to introduce future studies, critical future studies, into the States, and he sent the invitation to 100 universities, and they all said no to it. And one university, the president wanted to at least ask the faculty, and then the faculty said no. So it was a great riddle to us, and particularly since the dean who rejected it had no idea of Ossip Flechtheim. So, but it was obviously some danger, which people saw that this would be taught, and so it couldn't be taught. K College introduced then a future studies, but a positive one in which the future was very much like the present, but so it was the critical futurology which was the dangerous part, and therefore it had to go. There was some protest, Honors College, Sam Clark and so on, they all protested against it, but we didn't come through, and we consoled ourselves that maybe we could have it later, but I was very pessimistic about it. We made out of it a peace study, but then this peace study was repressed as well. Then we made out of it an environmental study, and that survived. So that survived up to the day, where people think they can talk about nature without talking about society, and that is less dangerous then. So that is in this strange way how our future studies survived. But it was in this future studies in which we foresaw the danger of a right-wing movement in the United States, so in terms of authoritarian populism, which then really happened. And so the New Yorker has recently stated that the Frankfurt School was the only sociological school which predicted Trumpism in here and also the similar movements all over Europe.
Right. And so there was something destabilizing about futurology, something destabilizing to the status quo, to be able to point out the trends, where we're heading, what's likely going to come out of the condition that we find ourselves in today, and thus it had to be repressed. In that case, is the university really about leading people out of ignorance, but somehow keeping them in ignorance?
Yeah. So it is the ignorance, you know, about what Heraclitus calls pantarei, everything moves. And particularly the power relations that they move, and that the oligarchs or the oligarchy which exists, you know, if they were feudal lords or slaveholders or capitalists, that they are not forever. In Germany it was a crime to think what would be after Hitler. There was Father Delp, a Jesuit, who was hanged in the Kreisauer Kreis, the purpose of which was nothing else than what will happen after Hitler. So this idea, what will happen after or so, is a threat to the system which exists and which wants to maintain itself under all circumstances. But it is the negativity in the old system which pushes automatically beyond it. So the more slums we have, or the greater the distance is, the income between the CEO and the other workers and so on, the more people become angry or so, the more the system itself moves beyond itself. And then the new system, whatever the name is, then determinately negates the old system. That means it rescues some of the things but rejects others. It's not an abstract negation that one says, you know, feudalism is bad or capitalism is bad and has to go. The next system always has to learn something from the previous system. It cannot create things out of nothing. So, but it is this movement which, to anticipate, which is dangerous for the status quo. And that is why future studies was rejected in the 1940s and then again in the 1980s. And it would continue that way. So, insofar as we have only two bourgeois parties, we have no Labour Party, we have really two liberal parties. One is the New Deal Democrats, and on the other side the neoliberals. The neoliberals are really earlier than the New Dealers. That means that the Reagan, as we said, went back behind Roosevelt, even the first Roosevelt, because they thought liberalism can now work. And what the Democrats did, the issue of subsidiarity, which they took from the papal encyclical letter, that means they were liberals, you should do your own thing, you're responsible for yourself, and then take your opportunities and so on. And if you cannot, then there is subsidiarity. Then the county, the city, the state, the federation will help you and so on. So that was the modification. To the extent to which liberalism became socially modified, it reduces the negativity of the system and therefore makes it last longer. If on the other hand you unleash the forces of capitalism without regulation and so on, you hasten the same process. So that is the situation in which we find ourselves. The ironical thing is, if Bernie with his ideas of a democratic socialism would come through, he would somehow mitigate the negativity of the system and would make it last longer. While if you take radically, you know, neoliberalism, you only hasten the process. But this kind of thinking then is dangerous, and that is why Hegel is rejected, Marx is rejected, Freud is rejected, and so on. So all the people who could probably help us in our present crisis are somehow not studied, which is rather a sad type of a story. So we repressed this type of, which is called dialectical thinking during the Great Depression, in order to stabilize our internal situation, but then paid a horrible price wherever we were faced with opponents who had a dialectical strategy, like in Vietnam, General Giap, who had learned from the Russian generals who defeated Hitler how to think dialectically, and that is how we lost the war in Vietnam. And the same thing happened with the bad generals whom we fired in Iraq, and who were also from the same Zhukov school, were dialectical, and are still joined ISIS finally, and are leading the strategy of ISIS, be it in the Near East or now it all has moved to Africa. So therefore maybe it is not good to repress, particularly the first new logic after Aristotle. We repressed and stayed with Aristotle or versions of it. It would be very good if we would teach not only in our military academies but in our universities the newer type of a logic which thinks dynamically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, most definitely. The counter-revolutions, the successful counter-revolutions, were 1989 in Germany with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then later on in 1991, the end of the Soviet Union, ushered in an age of triumph for the liberal world. It was the end of history. Right? It was going to be liberalism and democracy. That was it. That's our fate now. But at the same time, this is the same type of capitalistic society, a class hierarchy that was certainly in place in the early part of the 20th century, and it brought about the great catastrophe of World War II and the Holocaust and Auschwitz and whatnot. And doesn't it seem a bit naive to think that we're reproducing the same type of conditions that we did before, and they won't have a backlash? It won't come back to us. There won't be some kind of inner critique of the liberal society that brings back the fascism that we saw in the early 20th century. Where does the critical theory stand on that? Where do you stand on that?
Well, that was exactly the decision when I was sent back from the prison camp to Germany in order to transform the fascist state into a liberal state. Then friends of mine, Eugen Kogan, Walter Dirks and so on, we wanted to have a Christian Democratic Party which would create a social state rather than a liberal state, because to bring back the old model before the First World War, the Weimar Republic, out of which fascism came, one could easily predict that the same society would finally develop a new authoritarianism, new racism, new nationalism, new fascism, and so on, as it really has happened. Hitler predicted that fascism would return, but centuries, he thought it would happen in centuries, it happened 70 years later. So that is where a mistake was made, where a great chance to make a real transformation was missed, and what we have now, that is is the price which we have to pay for this. So it is really true that neoliberalism, was successful in its revolution the counter-revolution in 1989. So, and it looks one way for us, it looks another way for the Russians. For the Russians, it was the most horrible defeat in their history, and Putin takes that up and tries to overcome that, and that gives him that popularity in Russia now. We don't know exactly what will happen now in the Slavic world, what will happen in the American world. The fact is that we have taken over the heritage of Europe, that Europe has since quite some time moved into retirement, that the American and the Russian forces met in Thuringia in the middle of Europe, and that Hitler, who wanted to make Europe great again, did exactly the opposite, namely moved by declaring war on Russia and the United States, brought these front runners into the historical process more than they had been there before. So he achieved the exact opposite of what he wanted. So, but now the question is, we are these front runners, and the question is what we do now in this situation. And one thing is not to have wars between the American and the Slavic world. Both have atomic weapons. That's unbelievably dangerous. But that it should rather be a competition between them. Who gets rid of the slums? Who extends the life expectancy? who has the better educational system, the better health care, and so on. So they will be in some kind of an antagonism, but it should be a fruitful one, a productive one, which leads us forward, maybe to a world federation with one army, and therefore to exclude the war danger and so on. So that's our present situation. So.
Yeah. One of the things that always was important to me with the critical theory was that somehow it wasn't wholly secular. It maintained some kind of open door to the religious. And that is something you can see in your own life. Unlike many other scholars, philosophers, sociologists who become completely secularized, you've maintained a commitment and a connection to the Catholic Church. In one of the most forceful ways of doing that, it has been through your lectures at the church over the course of the last so many decades. What was the ultimate point of continuing to teach in the church?
Mm-hmm. Well, the overall situation is, of course, this antagonism between the religious and the secular, which is really now 500 years old. It goes back to the Renaissance and so on. But it has gone deeper and deeper. And so it splits the religious people and the secular people, the believers and the enlighteners and so on. But it splits also the religious people among themselves, namely those who are open toward modernity and those who stick with revelation and tradition, but others want to be believers and want to be open to modernity and enlightenment and science and so on. But you have a split then also among the secular people. Some of them want to get rid of religion as fast as possible, the agnostics or the atheists and so on. They think it's dangerous for human species, that religion belongs to the childhood affair, which we should really leave behind. But there are others, and the Frankfurt School belongs to them, who are critical of religion, of everything what was criminal and evil in religion. But they also would like to retain some contents, like the Sermon on the Mount, or the love of the neighbor, or solidarity. So the great thoughts of religion, the golden rule, so they would like to translate into modernity, would like to secularize them. And so the issue is then, that you have in the Frankfurt School, you have on one side Adorno, who says, I do not believe, and you have Eugen Kogon, who is the author of the SS State, and Walter Dirksen says, we do believe. So both have in common, for instance, the Christology from below. They think, Jesus was a fact. Jesus has existed and so on. And he has taught certain things and certain ways of acting, and love of the neighbor, love of God, and so on. So that is a fact. But besides the fact, there is another thing, decision. What do you decide? Do you accept that teaching or don't you accept? So both sides have a Christology from below. Jesus' life is a fact. It's not true that he has not existed or is just a myth or whatever. As a fact, he has taught something, and so some people in the Frankfurt School would say he's like Socrates. So both were killed by the state, and so they have great similarities with each other. But one side then makes a decision for it, to accept it. The other one makes a decision against it. So that means against what? They agree in the Christology from below, the fact. But they do not agree on the Christology from above, that Christ is the Son of God, or so. That is not a fact. That is faith. That is a matter of decision. And so the critical theorists then think that this decision is irrational. That means that it is called decisionism, and that it is practiced in fascist circles, where people make a decision for the Führer, for the leader, for the Duce, and so on. And it is not really based on reason, but it's based on trust and on faith and so on. So that is a split, you could say, between fact and decision. Both recognize the fact. Both have this Christology from below. But the acceptance of Jesus' teaching and the following of it, that is a matter of decision, which one makes or does not make, and which the critical theorists do not make. and which the Dirksen Kokon and I myself make. So that is the discrepancy.
Mm-hmm.
But they remain friends with each other, you know, they cooperate with each other, and they respect each other, that one can make this positive decision and the other cannot make this positive decision.
And I think it was even Habermas who said something about if you can still be religious in this world, in this secularized world, then remain religious. But if you can't be, that doesn't mean you have to become a greedy bourgeois or something like this. That somehow there's things in religion, semantic and semiotic material, that can be translated into secular language, a secular moral principles or whatnot, so that you maintain some kind of connection with that old religious stuff, but you don't have to buy into or commit yourself to the things that are no longer believable to you.
Yeah.
And that seems to me like a pretty rational position for modern people. That just because you're not religious anymore, in the good religion, not the hypocritical bad religion, but good religion, even if you can't believe it anymore, that doesn't mean you have to somehow go to like the dark side, let's say.
No, right. And of course, it was a prejudice, of course, that if you lose your faith, you know, that then you become immoral, and so, which is of course not true. There are humanists, you know, there are secular people who are much more moral than their religious counterparts. So Habermas would, you know, he's now in his 91st year, he just celebrated his birthday, would say, you know, I have become old, but I have not become pious. I've become old, but not pious. So he cannot make that positive decision. He cannot say credo, but he says non credo, I do not believe. And that has to be respected, and that is serious, right? So he can talk about Jesus and his wonderful moral teaching and so on, but he cannot make that decision, this positive decision, like Adorno, who was his teacher, and so on. So, this split remains.
Mm-hmm. So even though most of them would on a very surface level, say that they were atheists, they don't believe, nevertheless they may remain respectful towards religious believers, because there's some utopian element in religion that they wished, or attempted to at least, bring into critical theory.
Yeah. Well, it has to do with the Enlightenment, that everything has to be put before the judgment of reason. And so that Jesus exists, that can be affirmed by reason. But that one follows him, you know, in terms of denying the lex talionis, to loving the enemy and so on, or that this claim that he is the Son of God in a very special sense and so on, that cannot be verified by reason, and therefore it is not acceptable. It is then called decisionism, which is considered to be irrational.
Right, right. Well, we're running out of time, but we've got a little bit of time left to get into some things that we're going on now. You're now, in the summer of 2019, about to retire after 54 years at teaching at Western Michigan University. So that means how many hundreds of thousands of students you've educated? You've led out of ignorance, as educare means, education. And when you reflect back on your time at Western, what do you think the most important thing is that you did there? What's the most impactful thing you did there?
Well, I got a wonderful certificate from the governor of the state of Michigan, which counts all the accomplishments, and I am very happy about all what we did in terms of Dubrovnik and Yalta and the teaching here and the many books we wrote and articles and so on. And it was, of course, the attempt to reconcile religion and enlightenment. So we see both of them as positive forces, and we see both of them endangered. And so what I taught the students were these two things, and how to bring them together in an open discourse, not to close up the discourse positivistically or naturalistically, but also not fundamentalistically on one side or the other. So to find ways to agree with each other. So when we talk stem cell research. The religious people cannot say yes to it because of the killing of the embryo, but both sides agree that it would be good to heal Alzheimer's. Both agree that the embryo is human. They disagree that the embryo is already a person with rights and so on. But both sides change, and both sides can progress. And while they have to say now we have to agree to disagree, it is very possible that by changes in science or changes in the faith position that they can get together later on. So that is what we try to teach. We try to teach discourse between these two sides, which produce so many problems in personal life and economics and politics and culture and so on. And I'm very happy with what we did and all the friends whom I had, and that we, could, in spite of the fact that theology, is not to be taught in American universities. In Slovenia, Slovenia is a socialistic state, but they teach theology in their state universities. But we could not do that here. But nevertheless, I always combined theology and comparative religion with each other, and that was, I think, legitimate to do that. So, and in this context, we could do quite a productive way. And you are the great witness of this movement, and many of our friends around here and in Europe and Canada and so on, and even Central and South America and Japan and all around the globe.
Yeah, it'll be 25 years this fall that I started studying critical theory of religion.
We cooperated for a long time.
Absolutely. We've traveled all over.
Right.
We've done conferences in Rome and in Russia and all over the place.
Yeah, and all the beautiful books you produced already, so they're all an application of the critical theory to Islam, particularly, which is a wonderful accomplishment.
Well, I got big shoes to fill.
Well, you do.
All right. Well, I think that's about all we have for today.
Yeah, well, maybe for just a second. I'm going to ask you a couple questions here because I think I'm a guy who is not deep into the critical theory of religion. I know of your past and I know of your autobiography, but for me, maybe a question to ask that I think would be pertinent to people who may not know is, tell me, what do you think is your most significant accomplishment in your life?
Well, I think in terms of academics, I think it's, of course, my family. I think, I had 8 children and 14 grandchildren, and I have 5 great-grandchildren. Mm-hmm. I think that's a beautiful accomplishment. We just were together in Holland and so on. So, but in terms of professional life, I think the foundation and the development of the critical theory of society and religion, that is probably the accomplishment.
Okay. And Dustin, as you look at it from someone who came into it 25 years ago, you weren't at the beginning of the formation of the critical theory, but when you look at Rudy in the 25 years that you have spent with him, what do you see, and as a person, and what do you see as his most critical accomplishment to our world?
Oh man, that's one heck of a question. The most
I can ask him. I can't ever answer him.
That's what most academics are like too. Career change. No, for me, traveling with Rudy to Europe, to Ukraine, to Russia, to Germany, to Italy, to Croatia, and all the places that we've been to, I see the amount of respect he has from other scholars, from his peers, from people who just know him, who aren't academically inclined, but that know the measure of the man. The fact that he takes his students out every Saturday for lunch, and his colleagues and other people who are his students from 30 years ago still show up to these. That type of care for the world, and that type of care for the people that you are close to in the world is hard to come by. It's an older, more human way of being in the world that I think he exudes in everything he does, from his scholarship to his personal life to his relationship with his family. I've come to know many of his family members, and it is clear just how much they love this man. And I haven't met anybody who hasn't, perked up when they heard the name Rudy Siebert.
Yeah. Well, let me ask a question in a not a critical theory answer. Tell me, get out our crystal ball for just a second. Where do you see our society, and let's just concentrate on the United States, where do you see our society going, and how can the critical theory of religion actually really help shape that?
Well, I mean, the critical theory is concerned with this antagonism of religion and the secular, but there are many other antagonisms, and one is that between the classes. So that we have the middle class, the upper middle class on one side, and then we have the working class, and that we don't have a Labour Party, which would be of utmost importance. You go to Ottawa, there is a Labour Party. You go to London, there is a Labour Party. You go to Paris, there is no capital where there is not a Labour Party in Parliament. And we have two bourgeois parties in that strange language, you know, two middle class parties, two liberal parties, and we have no Labour parties, no real opposition. We have a formal democracy, which is an exchange of power between two bourgeois parties every 4 years or 8 years. But we need more of an opposition in order to cover all these individual particular questions like wages and wage difference and whatever. So, and the whole slum business, that there is a slum in every city. We got used to that, and urban and rural slums and so on. Maybe 40 million, 50 million people live in there and so on. So these negativities have to be overcome, and we would suggest, you know, that this cannot happen without a Labour Party. And of course the unions are doing a good job in many ways, but they cannot really operate without a Labour Party, as it is in all other Western countries. So we would suggest that this step has to be taken, and we will not be able to take it up to the next election. It is too short, and so it is very well possible that Trump will come in terms of the immediate future in another 4 years or in another 8 years. If he wants to leave then, that's another problem. So we are in a crisis, you know, of our democracy, and we cannot blame the Russians alone for that crisis. There are other things which we have to face with ourselves without them.
Well, change may be coming, and we do know one thing, that man will not leave office without a fight. So,
That's true.
With that being said, I want everybody to know this is the end of our Chapter 4, the autobiography of Rudolf J. Siebert, and to be on the lookout for more podcasts to come, which are really going to start getting into the critical theory of religion, what it's all about, how it's a part of our world, how it can be more of a part of our world, and all those good things that come with it. And I'm sure we may talk about some of the other things that aren't as good, not necessarily as the critical theory goes, but our world in general. So, guys, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I think this is great stuff for everybody. All right.
Thank you.
Yes, you are so welcome. And not that we have a name for it, but this would be the time with Rudolf J. Siebert, and we'll see you soon.